Jake had always been a bit of a gearhead, particularly when it came to vintage synthesizers. Living in Phoenix from 2007 to 2012, he'd made a habit of scouring Craigslist for hidden gems, old analog synths, dusty drum machines, anything with a story and potential for revival. One hot summer morning, as he lazily browsed through the listings, something caught his eye. Vintage synthesizers, cheap and need gone ASAP. The post was short, almost cryptic. There was just one blurry photo that seemed to show an Alpha Juno, but it was hard to tell for sure. The ad provided little detail beyond an address in Hollow Creek, a part of town where most people wouldn't venture after dark, if they ventured there at all. But for Jake, this was a lead worth following. He grabbed his keys, jumped into his '82 Ford Bronco, and headed out. The engine roared to life, its familiar rumble a comfort as he navigated through the city. As he drove, the vibrant streets and modern buildings gradually gave way to a more desolate landscape. Hollow Creek was a place where Phoenix's forgotten dreams went to die. Abandoned buildings, graffiti-covered walls, and streets that seemed eerily quiet even in the daytime. When Jake arrived at the address, he found a squat, crumbling house that looked like it could collapse at any moment. The windows were shattered, the front door barely hanging on its hinges. As he approached, he could hear faint music coming from inside, warped and dissonant, like a record being played backward. He pushed the door open, stepping into a room that smelled of burnt wood and dust. The interior was a wreck, scorched walls, debris scattered everywhere. But in the far corner, his eyes locked onto what he'd come for, a pile of synthesizers, neglected and covered in grime. Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "You here for the synths?" "Yeah," Jake replied, trying to keep his tone casual despite the unease creeping up his spine. "What's the story with them?" The man gestured lazily at the pile. "Old gear from a band that used to play here. They're long gone, left this stuff behind. Are you a musician?" "Sort of," Jake said, his attention now fixed on one synth in particular, a Moog Voyager. Even through the dust and grime, he could tell it was something special. "That one," the man said, noticing Jake's interest. "It's been through some shit. There was a fire here a while back. Ever since, it hasn't made a sound. But if you think you can fix it, it's yours for $400. Jake hesitated. The price was suspiciously low, especially for a Voyager, but the potential reward was too tempting to pass up. He handed over the cash, loaded the synth into his Bronco, and headed home, eager to see what he could do with it. Back at his apartment, Jake wasted no time. He set the Voyager down on his workbench and began the meticulous process of cleaning it. As he wiped away the soot, he noticed something strange. Carvings on the underside of the synth. They were symbols, intricate and unfamiliar, like something from an ancient text. They sent a shiver down his spine, but he was too focused on the potential of the synth to let it bother him for long. Once the Voyager was clean, he connected it to his setup and powered it on. The lights flickered to life, but something was off. The display screen was filled with scrambled characters, a jumbled mess that made no sense. When he pressed a key, there was only silence, a deep, unsettling quiet that seemed to fill the room. Frustrated but determined, Jake decided to reset the memory, hoping to restore the original factory patches. He hooked the Voyager up to his computer and initiated a MIDI dump, watching as the data transferred. Suddenly, the synth emitted a low, droning hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The screen's scrambled text began to shift, slowly forming words that made Jake's blood run cold. "Help me." The hum grew louder, more distorted, as if the machine itself was crying out. The lights in the room flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own, twisting and stretching like living things. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the shadows creep closer, their shapes growing more defined, more menacing. Panic set in. He tried to turn off the synth, but the buttons were unresponsive. The droning noise became almost unbearable, and the shadows continued to close in, dark tendrils reaching out as if to grab him. The air grew thick, cold, suffocating. In a desperate move, Jake yanked the power cord from the wall, The room plunged into silence. The lights went out and the oppressive presence vanished. He took a moment to catch his breath, his hands shaking, but before he could fully collect himself, he heard something that froze him in place. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from directly behind him. Jake turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway was the man from the squat house. His hollow eyes now glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and his smile had twisted into something far more sinister. "I warned you," he rasped, his voice now distorted, echoing with the same droning hum that had filled the room moments before. "That one's got history." Before Jake could react, the shadows surged forward, their cold, inky tendrils wrapping around his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness, and his last thought was of the stories he'd heard about Hollow Creek, a place where musicians disappeared, their souls trapped in cursed instruments, doomed to play a haunting, eternal melody. Days later, when Jake's friend realized he hadn't heard from him, he decided to stop by and check in. What he found was a scene of horror. Jake's lifeless body was sprawled on the floor, his eyes wide open in terror, staring blankly at the now silent, moved Voyager. The room was eerily undisturbed, no signs of a struggle, nothing out of place, yet the expression on Jake's face told a different story. The police were baffled, the cause of death was undetermined, and the strange carvings on the underside of the synth only deepened the mystery. Officers who entered the room reported a strange, lingering hum that seemed to hang in the air, even after the Voyager was unplugged. That night, the synth vanished from the evidence room, leaving behind only questions and a growing legend. Word spread quickly through the local music scene. Musicians whispered about the cursed synth that had claimed Jake's life, speculating that it was haunted by the souls of those who had perished in Hollow Creek. Some believed it was revenge, others thought it was simply a warning. Some things are better left alone. In the end, Jake's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that not all treasures are worth the price. Sometimes the cost is far more than money, sometimes it's your very soul. It all began with a routine Craigslist search for a great deal on a guitar amp. I found an ad for a vintage Sano 500R tube amp priced significantly below its market value. The photos showed it in excellent condition, which made the deal too good to pass up. Despite its location being an hour away, I decided to make the trip. After a series of emails with the seller, we arranged a meeting time. He instructed me to call him once I arrived in his town, at which point he would provide me with the exact address. As I drove toward the location, the directions took me further from populated areas. The road became a winding path through dense woods, eventually leading to a gravel road beside a river. The surroundings felt remote and unsettling. When I reached the town, I called the number the seller had given me. He provided the address, but asked me to call him back on a different number when I arrived at the house, explaining that his phone was running low on minutes. This request seemed odd, but I proceeded to the address. Upon arriving, I saw a man standing in the open garage of a dilapidated house. He wore a cap pulled low over his eyes and a hoodie over the cap, obscuring his face. The garage was dimly lit, and the man's appearance was unsettling. Despite my growing anxiety, I approached the garage to inspect the amp. As soon as I stepped inside the garage, the man abruptly closed the garage door behind me. My heart raced as I realized I was trapped. The seller still hadn't shown his face, heightening my fear that I might be dealing with someone dangerous or desperate. Just as my anxiety peaked, the man opened the garage door and brought out the amp, plugging it in for me to test. To my dismay, the amp was in much worse condition than the photos had suggested. It was clear that he had attempted to repair it himself, drilling holes, applying gold spray paint, and covering it with duct tape. Despite its shabby appearance, the amp sounded great, and the internal components were clean. As I examined the amp, the seller hovered around, smoking a cigarette and coughing frequently. His demeanor and appearance suggested he was unwell. Feeling uneasy about the situation and worried about what might happen if I decided against buying the amp, I chose to pay for it quickly and leave. I managed to get out of there without incident, and the amp turned out to be a fantastic find after some restoration work. However, the experience served as a stark reminder that even seemingly great deals can come with hidden risks. Craigslist can be a treasure trove of great deals, but sometimes it's a gateway to something far more sinister. This shocking story involves my friend Jake, who was on the hunt for the latest iPhone 15 Pro at a bargain. A seller in a small town in the USA was offering the phone for only 20% of the retail price. It seemed too good to be true, but Jake's curiosity got the better of him. The seller claimed to have acquired the phones for free and needed to sell them quickly for cash. He asked Jake to meet him at a local frozen custard shop at 11 p.m. Jake, eager but cautious, and agreed. When Jake arrived at the shop, he found only a deserted, pitch-black parking lot. My little friend Tommy and I went with Jake. It was a desolate place, and the seller was nowhere to be seen. Jake froze in discomfort and decided to leave the eerie spot. But suddenly, almost immediately, the seller called out to him from a distance. Still uneasy, Jake reluctantly agreed to return. This time, he saw the seller's car headlights dimly illuminating the empty area. Despite his reservations, Jake called back to the seller, expressing his discomfort with the creepy setting. They finally agreed to meet instead at a nearby McDonald's. Rushing to the well-lit McDonald's, Jake felt a wave of relief. He called the seller to come inside for the exchange, but the seller had other plans. He instructed Jake to meet him in the back parking lot. Alarm bells rang in Jake's head, and he decided to back out of the deal, sensing a hidden agenda. After ordering some food, Jake and our little friend Tommy went back to the car. Suddenly, a masked man emerged from the shadows. He grabbed Tommy and shouted, "Give me all your money or he dies." My terrified friend pleaded, "Quick, give him all your money, I don't want to die," in a desperate move. Jake left Tommy and ran back into the McDonald's. He frantically called 911 as the employees quickly locked all the doors. The masked man let Tommy go, but remained trapped at the door until the police arrived. While leaving a child outside felt wrong, the fear of the gunman entering the restaurant was too great. Fortunately, Tommy was unharmed, but the terrifying experience left a lasting mark. Since that night, our families have sworn off Craigslist, forever wary of the dangers lurking behind seemingly unbeatable deals. Last month, I urgently needed a new roommate and found a woman who was moving from Florida to Los Angeles. Over the phone, she came across as a bit quirky and naive. However, when we met in person, her behavior turned out to be even stranger. She had no sense of personal boundaries. She would regularly eat my food, use my laptop, and barge into my room with her friends saying the most bizarre things. This unusual behavior started within the first week. As the month progressed, her behavior continued to deteriorate. She began hanging out with a coworker from a fast food restaurant and his friends, one of whom had just been released from jail. They mostly showed up to take advantage of her generosity and laughed at her odd antics. She often left the window open because she frequently lost her keys and talked about it openly. One day, her friends broke into the house. They stole my TV, my laptop, a smaller TV I kept in my room, a wedding dress, which my aunt had asked me to sell on eBay, and my prescription glasses. When I called her in a panic, she claimed she had just arrived home and had called the police on me. She accused me of stealing her broken laptop and suggested that I had removed all my belongings to frame her. The police arrived and, after speaking with me, advised that she seemed unstable and recommended avoiding Craigslist for finding roommates in the future. However, after talking to me and understanding my frustration, the police noted the details of the stolen items but did not get involved further. I had a hidden camera set up in the house that had recorded all her misdeeds. So after the police left, I called her and said, "You're stealing my belongings and I have proof. If you don't return my things, I'll show all the evidence to the police." Surprisingly, this tactic worked, and I recovered all my stolen items. My mother and dad are ranchers. They got a new work truck and decided to sell their old one. A woman from a rural area about 4 hours away showed strong interest but had numerous excuses for why she couldn't drive even halfway to get the truck. My dad, being overly accommodating, convinced my mother to follow him in a second vehicle on Saturday. so he could drive the truck to the woman. My mom was already suspicious of this lady. When they arrived, the woman gave a complicated story about having bank problems and handed over a post-dated check. She also begged my dad to leave the plates in his name. My mom stepped aside with my dad and had a heated argument about accepting the check and keeping the plates. She managed to cancel the plates but couldn't stop the check from being accepted. They drove another 4 hours back home, and as anyone but my dad would have guessed, the check bounced when the date came. The woman avoided phone calls for a while, but eventually answered with another elaborate story about being in the hospital and so on. My dad, for once, stood his ground and told her they would be taking back the truck. They drove another 4 hours back, this time with a flatbed truck in case any parts were missing. No one answered the door at the property, but they found the truck in a shed and loaded it up. While my dad was busy securing the load, my mom couldn't resist expressing her frustration. She wrote a note saying something like, "Thanks for nothing. Hope you enjoyed screwing us around," and slipped it under the door. 15 minutes into their drive home, the cell phone rang. The woman who was supposedly in the hospital was on the line. She threatened to take the note to the police and have them charged with harassment. My mom reminded her that she would have to explain her own attempted fraud. The woman hung up and they never heard from her again.